Hi, I'm Lilly Anderson-Messec with the Florida Native Plant Society. Did you know that the Florida Panhandle is actually a hotspot for carnivorous plant biodiversity? Join me today for a tour of the Apalachicola National Forest, and let's see how many carnivorous plant species we can find. So here we are, first stop on our Apalachicola National Forest field trip of carnivorous plants. And this is probably what I would consider the king of carnivores in the Apalachicola National Forest, the cutthroat pitcher plant. So this is in this family, in the genus Sarracenia, in the family Sarraceniaceae, and it's Sarracenia flava. Varrugelii is what it was often considered because it's very different in formation than the more northern populations of Sarracenia flava. But the latest research has shown that they're not genetically distinct enough to be considered an actual variety, so they're really considered a color form of Sarracenia flava. Let's take a closer look. So carnivory is an evolutionary strategy that's very uncommon in plants, but it happens and it can occur in completely unrelated families. There are what we also call kind of pitcher plants on the other side of the world in Indonesia and Southeast Asia that are completely unrelated to our native Sarraceniaceae family here, but they look really similar, and that's called convergent evolution. It's selective pressures from the environment are forcing these plants to end up mimicking each other in a way because it is of successful form in that environment. And these plants are adapted to areas that are very nutrient poor, where there's very little competition. So they don't have competition from other plants, out shading them or outgrowing them, but they are adapted to get the nutrients that they need from invertebrates, insects and other invertebrates in the environment, rather than from the soil where most plants get the nutrients they need. So let's take a closer look at individual species. So what we call the pitchers, these long tubes, are actually modified leaves, and they're modified in order to catch and trap and digest insects. So the insects are attracted. You can see this shiny sticky liquid up here on the top. This is called the hood of the pitcher plant. That's nectar that entices the insects to the pitchers, and they nibble on it. And some of the species actually have intoxicants in the nectar in order to kind of confuse the insect or invertebrate. So once the insect comes around, it will continue to go down the tube enticed by the nectar. Once it's in the tube, there are downward pointing hairs that line the interior of the tube, and the tube is slick on the inside. So it makes it very difficult for an insect, once it's gone down into the tube, to exit. And so it continues to go back down since it's hard to get back up, hoping that it will find an exit down at the bottom. But instead, it finds a pool of digestive fluids with enzymes and bacteria that can digest the insect within a period of hours or days, and then the plant is able to absorb those nutrients, the nutrients that are lacking in the soil that it desperately needs in order to persist. So that's a pretty cool and neat strategy to find the nutrients that these plants need. Okay, so here is another carnivorous plant that's in a totally different family. This is pink sundew, Drosera capillaris, and it's in the family Droseraceae. Okay, so again, this is Drosera capillaris, the pink sundew in the family Droseraceae, the sundew family. So this species forms a low-growing basal rosette, which means it just has low-lying leaves in a kind of rose shape that hug the ground. And at the tips of these leaves, it's a spoon shape or spatulate leaf. And at the tip, they have these long hairs that are just tipped off with sticky glands. And they glisten in the sun and can attract insects that might think that they are nectar, that there's nectar on them. And so little insects in this species, because it's low to the ground, is typically catching small little insects like little ants and such that are crawling around the ground. And I think I see a little insect right there. And so they're attracted to the glistening dew and then they get stuck. And once they get stuck and start moving, that triggers the plant to produce enzymes, digestive enzymes, and then the little hairs will curl towards the moving insect to further catch it and keep it, and then digest it right there on the leaf. And then it can absorb the nutrients from the insect. And you can see this long stalk right here is actually its flowering stalk and inflorescence. And this plant, the lower buds have already bloomed and are forming seed. And higher up, this one is just about to bloom. And of course you notice that the stalk is much higher above the leaves, because the plant doesn't want to kill its pollinators. It doesn't want to catch and eat its pollinators. It wants its pollinators to be high above the leaves so they aren't caught, so they can effectively pollinate the flowers in order to produce their seed. Pink sundew, Drosera capillaris. And one thing I'll add about this individual is that you'll notice, if you are familiar with Drosera capillaris, this one has extremely long petioles, these stalks that attach the leaf to the main part of the plant. And they're unsure right now whether this is, just some sort of ecotype that occurs in certain areas, or why exactly they have these extra long petioles. But sometimes this species is called a long arm pink sundew. So here we have another pitcher plant, and it looks very different than the last one we saw. So this is what many people consider to be Sarracenia flava var rubra corpora. Rubra means red and corpora means body, so red-bodied pitcher plant. Although, as I mentioned before, the latest research shows that they're not genetically distinct enough to be considered a variety. It's just a color form, but it's a beautiful one. They're very popular with collectors, unfortunately, and like many of our native carnivorous plant species, they are heavily poached in the wild. If you find pitcher plants, don't share the locations online, and be very careful about who you do share the locations with in order to avoid poaching from happening and also just degradation of these sensitive habitats. So here is another color form of Sarracenia flava. This is what a lot of people call Sarracenia flava var ornata. And it is very ornately designed with these red veins that go all the way up and down the tube. But like I mentioned before, it's just a color form. It's not genetically distinct enough to be considered a actual variety of flava. And then if we look down, we have a whole nother species in a different family of carnivorous plants right down here. So this pile of tongues down here is actually another carnivorous plant species in a totally different family. This is in the Lentiburlariaceae family, the butterwort family, and this genus is commonly known as butterworts, and the genus is Pinguicula. This specific species is Pinguicula planifolia, commonly known as Chapman's butterwort. And it often has this deep kind of purpley red colorations of the leaves, although sometimes they can be kind of greenish as well. And just as these Drosera, the Drosera capillaris pink sundew we saw earlier, catches the low-lying kind of ground-crawling insects, this species does as well. They're adapted to catch small little insects and invertebrates that are crawling along the ground. But they're also adapted for seasonal inundation, seasonal flooding. So if this species is usually low-lying and is in areas that gets flooded seasonally, and it's it has adapted to be able to eat invertebrates underwater as well, which is super cool. So their method of catching and trapping and digesting insects is really similar to the Drosera, the Sundews. They have sticky hairs, sticky glands on their leaves, these shiny, glistening glands, which attract insects that think that they might be nectar. And the insects get onto the leaves and then they end up getting stuck. And that movement, again, triggers digestive fluids to begin digesting the insect right there on the leaf. Super neat. Chapman's Butterwort, Pinguicula planifolia. Okay, here we have an extra cool species. In fact, when people think about carnivorous plants, this is usually the species they think about first. This is the Venus Flytrap, Dionaea muscipula. And it's actually in the same family as Drosera, the Sundews, Droseraceae family. So as you can see, we're lucky enough to catch these species in full bloom. So Dionaea is actually what we call a monotypic species, which means there's only one species within the genus Dionaea, and it's this one. Just one species of Venus flytrap, no others. This species is actually not native to Florida. It's endemic to the Carolinas. That's its natural native range, but was planted down here probably in the 40s and 50s, and it has naturalized in some areas. But because its natural populations, its natural range is not that far away, and it's a really similar habitat with the same associate species of flora and fauna, this species is still a functioning member of the ecosystem here, and so it's not considered invasive. And it really behaves itself. It hasn't spread all over the place like an invasive species would, because it's existing with the same associates. And as you can see here, we were lucky enough to catch them in full bloom. And just like the Drosera species, the sundew, they have long stalks that are well above their traps so that they're not catching their pollinators. They're not trying to eat their pollinators. And Dionaea is in the same family as Drosera, the same family as sundews, the Droseraceae family. So if you look a little bit further down, here are all their little traps. And these traps have tiny little hairs on the inside of them. When more than one hair is triggered, the trap closes up, and then that triggers the production of the digestive enzymes that will digest the insect inside the trap within a matter of days or hours, really. So let's see if we can trigger one of these traps here. I'm gonna stick my finger in and trigger those hairs, and there it goes. It will close up. And so this species, when it is triggered but doesn't get any food from the closing of the trap, it can reopen its trap until it catches enough food. And just like with the Sarracenia, these traps are modified leaves. So they're just leaves that have been modified in order to eat invertebrates. So as I mentioned earlier with the Sarracenia, carnivorous plants are highly coveted by collectors who really want to grow and hybridize and enjoy these species at home. Unfortunately, that puts a lot of pressure on them in the wild, and so people end up poaching them. And as you can see here, there's a hole in the ground, and that is a sign of poaching. I see this all too often, and it really breaks my heart. I just really would like people to be able to enjoy the plants in the habitat that they occur in, and you see so much more when you get to see them in context. If you really want to grow these plants at home, only purchase from reputable growers. Don't buy them from Facebook Marketplace or Craigslist or something, because those plants are probably poached from the wild. Only buy from larger, reputable growers who grow them from seed with the right permits. It's very much illegal to dig them from the wild like this, since this is a listed species. It's also just unethical. So growing among these Venus flytraps, you see these tall, sticky looking plants. And this is another Drosera species, another sundew. This is Drosera tracei, commonly known as Tracy's sundew. And just like the low-lying species, the pink sundew, this one has the same mechanism for trapping and digesting insects. You can see here's a little beetle that has gotten stuck on the leaves, and the plant will be able to digest that little insect right there on the leaf. Drosera tracei, Tracy's sundew. The Tracy's sundew is a common species in the forest as well. Okay, so we've seen a few color formations of Sarracenia flava, but here's a different species of Sarracenia. Let's take a closer look. This is Sarracenia minor, the hooded pitcher plant. And it's actually the southernmost occurring species of Sarracenia. It goes all the way down into the peninsula, into Okeechobee County, Florida. And no other species of Sarracenia goes that far south, so that's a neat fact. But it functions just like the Sarracenia flava. It catches insects in their modified leaves that form these tubes, and it digests them down at the bottom there. This one is slightly different in that it has this hood, and that's where the common name comes from, hooded pitcher plant. And it also has what we call light windows, these white spots on the back of the hood. That actually can fool an entering insect into thinking that there might be an exit on the other side, so they enter into the pitcher tube, and they end up down there at the bottom, digested by these hungry plants. So this, again, is Sarracenia minor, the hooded pitcher plant. This is an extra special species of butterwort. This is Pinguicula ionantha, the Panhandle butterwort. Let's take a closer look. So just like the Chapman's butterwort that we saw earlier, Pinguicula ionantha has these low basal leaves and these basal rosettes here, and they catch and digest insects on these leaves. This species is special because it only occurs in a few counties in the Florida Panhandle and nowhere else in the world. And so that means it's endemic to the Panhandle, and it's also an endangered species. So you'll notice this spot is a luscious green color, and that's because it was burned not that long ago during the growing season. And that's important because carnivorous plants in Florida are fire-dependent species. They rely on regular fire returns to the habitat in order for them to continue to thrive. If fire doesn't return regularly on a 1 to 3 year return interval, ideally, we end up getting shrubby plants, shrubby woody plants, and trees that will shade out the carnivorous plant species. And they might persist for a while in this shade, struggling along, but they will eventually succumb and die. So prescribed burn is a very critical component in managing habitat for carnivorous plants. So the sun is getting low, and we're about to call it a day, but we still have a few more Sarracenia species to see, so let's go check them out. So here we have Sarracenia rosea, the rose pitcher plant. This species was once thought to be included in Sarracenia purpurea, which is the northernmost occurring species of Sarracenia. It goes all the way up into Canada. But recently, genetic work has proven that this species is different. It also has different morphological characteristics. Morphological just means what it looks like, basically. So let's take a closer look. It has this beautiful veination in its hood, and it has what we call prostrate low-lying pitchers that kind of just lay down on the ground here. And so this species is specializing in, ground-dwelling insects and invertebrates. And this species also holds water. If you look down into some of these pitchers, you'll see liquid down in there. And there's a whole microcosm in there, a whole world of species that actually live inside these pitcher plants. There's even a species of mosquito that actually it lays its eggs inside there, and the larvae grow and live inside these pitcher plants. Pretty cool. So the sun's going down, it's our last stop of the day, and here we have our last species of Sarracenia to see. This is Sarracenia psittacina, the parrot pitcher plant. And it gets its name because these pitchers have what look kind of like a beak, which I guess reminded someone of a parrot. So this species is another prostrate species which has its pitchers laying flat on the ground. And this little flap here is called an ala, and there's actually nectar along it, and they help kind of train little insects that are kind of crawling along the ground will hit this ala here, and then they notice the nectar and they'll follow the nectar down to the pitcher entrance right there. And these white little light windows here trick the insect into thinking that there's an exit down there. So it will go in, and again, it will hit those cilia, which makes it hard for them to come back out. So they'll keep going down, thinking they'll find an exit, but they don't. And they become food for these glorious species. Parrot pitcher plant, Sarracenia psittacina. So thanks for joining me on this virtual tour of carnivorous plants in the Apalachicola National Forest. I am very hot and sweaty now and ready to go home and take a shower, but I couldn't help but stop to enjoy this beautiful dense stand of Sarracenia flava. So just a reminder that these plants occur in sensitive habitat. Too many visitors can cause irreparable damage to them. If you're visiting pitcher plants, please stick to the trails, be careful where you walk, and be very careful about sharing these locations. Never share them publicly online, and be careful about who you do share them with. Also, if you use iNaturalist, please obscure your observations of carnivorous plant species because they are heavily poached, unfortunately. They're very difficult to grow outside of their natural habitat. So if you do really want to grow them, just make sure that you are purchasing plants from a reputable grower who is growing them from seed and who is not poaching them from the wild.